number of years ago, according to an Associated Press report, a small congregation in the foothills of the Great Smokies built a new sanctuary on a piece of land that had been willed to them by a church member. 10 days before the new church was to open, however, the local building inspector informed the pastor that the parking lot was inadequate for the size of the building. Until the church doubled the size of the parking lot, they would not be able to use the new sanctuary. Unfortunately, the church, with its undersized lot, had used every inch of their land except for the mountain against which it had been built. In order to build more parking spaces, they would have to move the mountain that was in their backyard. Undaunted, the pastor announced the next Sunday morning that they would have a meeting that evening with all members who had what he called mountain-moving faith. He said, "Jesus promised that if we have faith as but a mustard seed, we can say to a mountain, 'Be lifted up,' and it will be lifted up." He said that they would hold a prayer session asking God to move the mountain from the backyard and to somehow provide enough money to have the land paved and painted in time for the scheduled opening dedication service the next week. At the appointed time, only 7 of the congregation's 300 members assembled for prayer. Many of those who failed to attend, citing that they didn't think that there was any point, that it was hopeless. Well, the 7 prayed for nearly 3 hours, and at 10 o'clock, the pastor said the final amen. The next morning, as he was working in his study, there came a loud knock at his door. When he called, come in, a rather rough-looking construction foreman appeared, removing his hard hat as he entered. "Excuse me, Reverend," he said. "I'm from Wilson Construction Company over in the next county. We're building a huge shopping mall there, and we need some fill dirt. Would you be willing to sell us a chunk of that mountain that's behind your church? We'll pay you for the dirt we remove, and then we'll pave all the exposed area free of charge if we can have it all right away. We can't do anything else until we get the dirt in and allow it to settle properly." Needless to say, the little church got its parking lot and was dedicated the next Sunday as originally planned. How's your faith these days? Move any mountains lately? Even more pointedly, are you building your life on the promises of God? This is something I would like to talk about this morning. Today we continue our study of the roots of our faith, taking an overview of the stories of key Old Testament figures. Our attention this morning turning to Jacob, his story being this. As noted last week, God's saving work for the people of Israel began with Abraham, who, in what should have been his AARP retirement years, instead left home and with his wife Sarah headed out to the land of Canaan in response to the call of God. Well, after many years and various adventures, God eventually fulfills his promise to this couple that they, though childless, will have offspring. And much to their obstetrician's surprise, at the age of 100 for Abraham and 90 for Sarah, they have a son, Isaac. And needless to say, this makes the cover of the National Enquirer. Well, Isaac then grows up and he marries Rebekah, and they start a family with twin boys, Jacob and Esau. But there's trouble looming even before the birth. The 2 boys fight with one another while still in the womb. Well, the day of the birth comes, not a moment too soon for Rebekah, and Esau is born first, with Jacob following, grasping his brother's heel. An omen for all that follows, the name Jacob meaning the grasper or the heel grabber. And as we quickly see, this is quite appropriate because Jacob is a real heel. Basically, he is a self-centered, manipulative jerk, okay? As the 2 boys grow to adulthood, Jacob subsequently cheats his brother out of his birthright, the inheritance that belongs to Esau as the firstborn. And then with the help of his mother, who favors him over his sibling, he cons both his aging, doddering father and his brother once again out of the blessing that is also supposed to be Esau's. Isaac is heartbroken. Esau is livid, and he makes it clear that the next time he sees his brother, he is going to kill him. And you thought you had trouble with your siblings, right? Well, in today's reading, Rebekah has gotten wind of this, and she has instructed Jacob to get out of town, to go to her family in Haran and stay there until this all blows over. Quite ironically, Rebekah believing that this will only take a short time, when in fact it turns out to take many years, decades even, with the end result being that Rebekah dies before Jacob returns. That is, in a curious plot twist, Rebekah never again sees this beloved son for which she has done so much, exactly because of what she has done. Anyway, Jacob is on the run. He's a fugitive. He can't go home. And what's in front of him is very uncertain and very dangerous. He's between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Essentially, Jacob's life is broken and in ruins, and while we may argue that it's his own fault, that he kind of deserves what he gets, still, he's in trouble and he needs help, and this is what the text focuses on. And as an aside, let us not forget that most often our own problems are ultimately most often pretty much our own fault as well, and that doesn't negate our need for help. If anything, it enhances it. And this is what the text looks at. Jacob is in trouble, his life is ruined, he's in crisis, he's running, and when he gets far enough away to be able to rest for a moment, he falls asleep and God visits him in a dream. And the dream is fairly straightforward. There is a ladder, or a staircase, linking heaven to earth with angels going back and forth, up and down. It's sort of the ultimate, Stairmaster infomercial. Right? It's the basis of the hymn we just sang, and the point is fairly direct. That heaven and earth are connected, that the two are joined, they're interactive. That is, that no matter how much our culture may continually try to argue to the contrary, there is no such thing as the secular and the sacred. It's all sacred, Jacob's ladder is an image that this world, our lives, are the place in which God moves and acts and lives. Most particularly in regards to the moment in the text that we're looking at, that Jacob's life is the place in which God moves, acts, and lives. This is what Jacob discovers here. It's the most unexpected turn. Here's Jacob, this con man, this no good sinner who's ruined the lives of everyone around him. Here he is deep in trouble. You'd expect God to just ignore him, or to leave him to suffer the consequences of his own actions, or best to come and scold him. But instead, God offers this image of divine human connection, most notably as God goes on to clarify, this connection being specifically located in Jacob himself. That Jacob is the person of the blessed, through which God's saving work will continue in this family, and that God's love and care rests upon him. God basically affirms and strengthens Jacob. A demonstration, I believe, not only of just what a tenuous moment this is in Jacob's life, but that God knows that this isn't the time to come down hard on him, but rather to lift him up. But even more, a demonstration of how God works with all of us in general. That no matter how we may come into the trouble that we're in, our own making or another's, God cares for us. This is what this text is all about. God's care of Jacob in time of crisis, and in him, us. And notice what takes place. God speaks to Jacob and gives him sort of the standard promises that have been given to this family throughout. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Basic standard promise that has already been given. But to this then God also adds some promises that have not been given to others so far in this saga. God adds, know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. Behold, I am with you. One scholar writes, the promise speech here extends beyond the standard promise to the fathers. The first two verses appear to be predictable and conventional within the story of Israel's patriarchs, land, offspring, and blessing. But the final verse is a promise addressed uniquely to Jacob. It is a promise not needed by those like Isaac who live lives without conflict, but Jacob faces special dangers. The promise is God's attentive response to his circumstance of danger. The behold of verse 15 breaks new ground. It says, pay attention. God offers a special threefold promise to this child of the blessing whose life is in danger. God gives a special series of promises to Jacob in a time of crisis, in a time of trouble, and this is what I like to look at. God promises three things to Jacob in his time of difficulty, and these encapsulate some of the most basic and repeated biblical promises of God to people in trouble. In effect, I see this text saying to Jacob and to the reader, these are the three main things that you can count on from God when your life is falling apart. You know what they are, you understand what they mean, or you're building your lives upon them. God's three main promises in times of trouble. Number one, God promises presence. Again, God says to Jacob, behold, I am with you. Behold, I am with you. Notice right off the top that God doesn't promise, Jacob, I'm going to fix everything for you. You'll never have any trouble. I'll make everything right and pain-free. No, God begins by saying simply, I will be with you. I am with you. The promise of presence. Not an absence of hardship, but the presence of God with us in times of hardship. Arguably the foremost biblical promise in times of trouble. We find it all over the place. Jesus said, "Lo, I am with you always. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me." Emmanuel, God with us. God's first promise to Jacob, God's first promise to us all in times of trouble. I am with you. Promise of presence. But now what does this promise mean? Does it simply mean that whenever things are horrible for us, that God stands there with us, that God sits by the bedside and holds our hand? I mean, that's really nice and all, but having someone there for us, having someone else, that's going through us with us. Have you ever noticed how comforting it is just to know that someone cares and is present to help? It's helpful, but is this all that this means? No. The promise of presence doesn't simply mean God is as a passive observer. It means far deeper that whatever we go through, God actually participates in and shares with us, literally takes upon God's own self. It means God enters our lives and shares our burden so that we don't have to carry the weight alone. In other words, it means that we don't go through any single hardship alone, and we need not go through it alone, carry it alone. And this, I believe, is one of the first crucial distinctions we need to make. One of the first key ways we tend to miss or misunderstand God's care in times of trouble. God's first promise is presence. Not to get rid of all pain and hardship, but to actually share our pain and troubles, to take it upon God's self so that we don't have to take it all alone in order that it may be survived. But notice that in order for this to happen, we have to be willing to open up and to let go of it. That is, we have to be willing to not carry all our troubles alone. We have to be willing to hand them over to the Lord. And sadly, more often than not, this fails to occur. It's hard to believe, but it's true. Think of it this way. Have you ever noticed how it is much easier to be a caregiver than a care receiver? You'd think it'd be easier the other way around. No, it's far rather to receive rather than to give, but it's not. Just think about how miserable it is to lie in a hospital room, being needy, receiving help. It's frightening. It's powerless, not powerful. And thus many people fight such an experience with all that they have. They don't want others to know they have troubles. They don't want others praying for them sometimes. They refuse to ask for help. They hide and hold their difficulties, and thus they block God's care, God's promise of presence in their lives. It's done in the name of courage, but it's often actually cowardice and foolishness. We end up carrying it all ourselves, and it is just too much, and it destroys us. Recently, I read the following. What is the most important element of success in life? Well, according to one recent study, the primary skill is relationship. How powerful is this? Well, it can make the difference between life and death. Dr. Lisa Berkman of the Harvard School of Public Health headed a study that followed the lives of 7,000 people in Alameda County, California for 9 years. They inquired whether the people were married or lived alone, what kind of contact they had with friends and relatives, and whether or not they belonged to a church or other religious organization. When they evaluated the group's risk of dying, quote, the most isolated people were 3 times more likely to die in that 9-year period than those with stronger social ties. What lesson can we learn? Plug into relationship, get outside yourself, and live. God's promise in times of trouble is first presence, God with us, relationship, which asks of us first, how am I going it too much alone? Either simply in not offering my problems fully to God in prayer and worship and devotion, making God part of my life. But even more, in not opening myself up to how God is seeking to be with me, most notably in the lives of the other people around me, in connection to life beyond me, in sharing my life with others, in talking, in actually asking for help, in getting involved. How am I going it too much alone? Preacher Tom Gibson writes, one night, while my young son Ryan was sleeping, a storm began brewing outside. After a loud clap of thunder, I heard him awake, so I headed toward his room to comfort him. He asked me to stay with him until he fell asleep. As I lay there, I suddenly realized that he hadn't asked me to make the storm go away, but just to stay with him. For him, it was more than enough. How many times, I wondered, had I asked God to take away the storms of my life and was angry when he hadn't, when instead what I really needed was just to ask for him to be with me. Promise number 1 in times of trouble is presence. I am with you, God says. Promise number 2, provision. Once again, returning to the text, God says to Jacob, know that I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. God's second promise is to keep Jacob. Once again, this is an extremely prevalent biblical promise. The Lord bless you and keep you, we're told. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right side. God's second promise is to keep. God promises to keep Jacob. But again, what does this mean? Well, the word keep is used in a lot of places in the Old Testament. It's interpreted in a lot of different ways. That's to guard or to protect or to provide. But essentially it means to watch over and to look after someone else. For instance, in the story, you remember the story of Cain and Abel? When God questions Cain about his brother's death, Cain replies, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It's the same word as here. That is it my job to look after him? Of course, by the way, the answer is yes. But the image is basically that of a parent watching over their child. Now think about that. This image has two very important aspects to it. First, it reminds us that quite often what God will provide for us will not be what we want. I mean, does a parent automatically give their children whatever they desire? Not if they're good parents, right? What's the old proverb? Insist on giving your children nothing but the best, and you can expect nothing but the worst. A good parent provides what's needed, not simply what's required, what's wanted. Same here. And related to this sense, secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, when a parent looks after their child, does this mean that the child never faces any trouble or danger? Again, no. It doesn't mean an absence of danger and negation of it. It simply means that the parent steps in and helps the child when problems arise. That is, you let them go their own way and only step in when there's something that's beyond them, something that they can't do, that they can't handle. This is very important. God's second promise in times of trouble is provision, that God will keep us, watch over us, protect and provide for us what is needed, what we don't have and can't do. It challenges us to ask ourselves, are we attentive to how God is providing what we need each day? Maybe not making everything perfect, but offering what is required for the next step of the journey? And are we doing what we can to take hold of this, our part, what we can, what we have, and what we can do? Have you ever heard the story of a man who longed to win the lottery? I realize it's a very un-Methodist illustration. But there once was a man who desperately wanted to win the lottery. Day after day he prayed to God to let him win, but he never did. Finally, after a couple of months of this with no result, the man was really angry with God. He looked heavenward and he said, "Dear God, why won't you let me win the lottery? Don't you love me?" Suddenly from heaven there came a voice in response. God said, "Of course I love you, and I'm more than happy to let you win the lottery. It's just one thing. Could you at least meet me halfway and for once actually buy a ticket?" We need to at least meet God halfway, there's an old saying that God feeds the birds of the air, but he doesn't throw the food into their nests. Right? The second promise, God provides. Maybe not everything made perfect, but what we need for the next step along the journey. Are we recognizing this and reaching out to take hold of it? Reading from another news story from a number of years back. Mr. Alter's 5th grade class at Lake Elementary School in Oceanside, California includes 14 boys who have no hair. Only one, however, had no choice in the matter. Ian O'Gorman undergoing chemotherapy for lymphoma. Ian was very nervous about his return to school after many months of treatment. Most especially, he was worried about being teased for his appearance. Much to his surprise, he walked into a class only to be greeted by a sea of bald heads, said 10-year-old Kyle Hanslick, who started it all. We had called him on the phone while he was in the hospital, and we had sent cards, we had visited him, and we had brought him gifts, but we knew that it wasn't enough. The last thing he would want is not to fit in. We had to do something, but what? Then it hit us. It wasn't an easy decision. Some of our parents weren't too thrilled. But looking back on his reaction, I know we couldn't have been more right. And Ian's father, Sean, choked back tears as he talked about the boy's actions. And he said simply, "I was so worried, but God was working ahead of time to provide for Ian exactly what he needed that day." I'll never forget that. It's hard to put into words how much these boys have done for my son. But I know one thing. I'm going to go get my head shaved tonight. Promise number 2 in times of trouble. Provision. I will keep you, God says. And finally, promise number 3 is progress. Once again, God says to Jacob, "Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land." God's final promise is the promise of homecoming, of return. I will bring you back to this land. Once again, it's a very common biblical promise. They that go forth with weeping shall come home with shouts of joy. Behold, Jesus says, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. It's a promise of return, of homecoming, specifically with an inference of change and renewal, of things made better. And this is finally what is happening here. The final promise to Jacob and to us, again, is not the absence of problems, the avoidance of them, easy answers, quick, happy endings, but rather quite the opposite. That God is in for the long haul. No easy answers, no simple fixes, the long term, not just a moment, return, confrontation of these toughest of all places. Most especially the implication being that God is thinking big, that God will finally be working in all of this change. That Jacob will come back to this broken place, this broken moment, but it won't be as it was. He won't be who he now is. In effect, this is what God is finally saying to Jacob. Jacob, I'm going to bring you back to this. We're not done with this here. But it and you will not be as they now are. It will be different. You will be different. You will be a changed, better person. This is God's final key promise in times of trouble. It's progress. It's return, but made new. In effect, that how God finally cares for us is not simply to fix our problems, to solve them, to get rid of them, but to use them as part of a much larger, greater work in us and beyond us. Change and renewal and improvement. That is, that God thinks much bigger issue, much longer term than we do, and he's calling us to do the same. This is finally what this text asks of us, invites us to ask in times of hardship and trouble. Am I thinking big enough? Long term, big picture, great issues, not just getting over this moment, fixing this problem. Is my goal instead improving something in me or beyond me or through me, made better because of the hardship? Simply put, are we looking to be changed because of our hardships, or just for Big Daddy to make everything all right? How often do we finally miss God's care because we are failing to look for the larger issue of how God is working the recreation that is ultimately the deepest experience of God's care, not simply everything made right? Author Cheryl Thompson writes, Jack tossed the papers on my desk, his eyebrows knit into a straight line as he glared at me. What's wrong? I asked. He jabbed a finger at the proposal. Next time you want to change anything, you ask me first, he said, turning on his heels and leaving me stewing in anger. How dare he treat me like that, I thought. I had changed one long sentence and corrected the grammar, something I thought that I was paid to do. It's not that I hadn't been warned. The other women who had served in my place before me called Jack names I couldn't repeat. One co-worker even took me aside the first day, saying he's personally responsible for 2 different secretaries leaving the firm. As the weeks went by, I grew to despise Jack, which wasn't difficult. It was against everything I believed in, turn the other cheek and love your enemies and so forth, but Jack repeatedly slapped a verbal insult on any cheek turned his way. One day, another of his episodes left me in tears. I had it. I stormed into his office, prepared to lose my job if needed, but not before I let this man know how I felt. I opened the door and Jack glanced up. What? He said abruptly. Jack, I said, the way you've been treating me is wrong. I've never had anyone speak to me this way. As a professional, it's wrong, and it's wrong for me to allow it to continue. You need to change your behavior. Jack snickered nervously and leaned back in his chair. Okay, he said, don't make a federal case out of it. Don't get your knickers in a bunch. Great, I thought. But at least he hadn't dismissed me outright. We settled into a kind of grudging relationship, and the months passed. 1 year after our talk, I discovered that I had breast cancer. I was 32, the mother of 3 beautiful young children, and very scared. The cancer had metastasized to my lymph nodes, and the statistics were not great for my long-term survival. After surgery, I visited with friends and loved ones who tried to find the right words to say. No one knew what to say. Many had said the wrong things. Others wept, and I ended up having to try to encourage them. The last day of my hospital stay, the door suddenly opened, and there stood Jack. He walked over to my bed and, without a word, placed a bundle beside me. Inside lay several flower bulbs. Tulips, he said. I smiled awkwardly, not understanding. He cleared his throat. If you plant them when you get home, he said, they'll come up next spring. I gave him a look as if to say, I don't think I'll be here next spring. He then leaned in close and stared straight into my eyes and said, next spring, you will see the colors I picked out for you. Got it? And then he turned and left. Over the months ahead, he became one of the most frequent and remarkably awaited visitors. We talked and we laughed and we cried. And in the spring, I saw the colors he had picked out for me. I have seen those red and white striped tulips push through the soil every spring now for 10 years. I'm still scared, but I have seen my children graduate from high school and I've danced at my daughter's wedding. Most of all, my whole world has changed. I'm different, work is different, Jack is different, life is different. It's all better somehow, more right, more meaningful, more valuable. And maybe that's what God was really doing most of all in all of this. It has been said that God promises and hope anticipates, patience waits, wisdom seeks, and faith embraces. God's three main promises in times of trouble: presence, provision, and progress. Jacob built his whole life on these promises, and so can we. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 374, Standing on the Promises. Would you please stand?